Peace be upon you all. I'd like to welcome you on the second day of our symposium on Islamic movements in uh, governance. This second series is going to examine the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. This is our second session in this series. It's going to be entitled, sorry, microphone. Shall I start over? Peace be upon you all. I'd like to welcome you on the second day of our symposium on the experiences of Islamic movements in politics and governance. This is the second symposium after we started 3 weeks ago on examining the experience in Sudan, and today this time we're examining the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Yesterday we started our first session on the relation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the state, and today we have two sessions on politics and performance and a future outlook as well. We are going to have two speakers in this session. The first is going to be an evaluation on the organizational crisis within the Muslim Brotherhood. Is it a generational or administrative issue or ideological issue? Our speaker is going to be Mr. Ammar Fayed, who is a PhD student in Istanbul Aydin University, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Asbab platform for geopolitical studies. His research focuses on Middle East and Islamic movements. He contributed to two publications, one on the Salafist movement in the Arab world, and he has another paper published in another book called Political Islam. He also has a number of studies published in a number of academic journals, most recent of which the Egyptian-Turkish relations. He recently contributed to a book called Islamists After a Decade of the Arab Spring, and it constitutes a number of papers presented in a conference with the same title. Our second speaker in today's session is Mr. Shadi Ibrahim, who is a master's scholar in Sabah ad-Din Zaim University. He also works in our SIGA center, and also he is one of the founders of Al-Asima Forum for Studies. He has many publications in Al Jazeera for Studies Center, as well as Al-Asima website. He is interested in military-civilian relations and the Middle East issues. At the end of both presentations, we're going to have two commentators. The first is going to be Mr. Yasser Fathi. Yasser is a scholar in discourse analysis and linguistics. He's also a PhD student in that discipline in Turkish University. He manages a group of political and motivation concerned with analyzing political motivations in Egyptian movements, and he was a lecturer in Ibn Khaldun University here in Istanbul. He's also the formal executive manager of the Egyptian Institute for Studies and by the way, the Egyptian Center or Institute is one of our partners in this symposium. Our second commentator is going to be Mr. Tariq Al-Zumur, who is a PhD holder in political science from Cairo University. He teaches and he also has another degree from Ain Shams University. He was released after the revolution of January after 30 years in detention in Egyptian prison under Mubarak's rule, 10 years of which were arbitrary detention, extrajudicial arrest, and he founded a party at the beginning of the revolution and contributed to the parliament, and then he was elected as the first president for that party in 2013, in June 2013, before the coup, and he was re-elected as a president for that party, and he has a number of publications, Coercion in Islamic Jurisprudence, globalization and its impact on the Islamic world, and many other publications. The other commentator, Mr. Ammar, is going to talk about, our second, speaker is going to talk about the crisis of organization within the Muslim Brotherhood, and then Mr. Shadi is going to talk about the organizational structure pattern and its impact on the method of decision making. Please go ahead. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. Thank you so much, Seika, for Istanbul Zaim University and all the organizers and the partners to sponsoring this event. Actually, talking about internal disagreements within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood is not an easy undertaking for very important reasons, one of which the Muslim Brotherhood deals with the Muslim Brotherhood as a black box, i.e., they deal with what emerges from that group, from its performance, its statements, but tackling its internal affairs is limited and restricted, and that is to do with the Muslim Brotherhood operated for most of its history in a hostile environment, thus very discreetly. So in order to try to understand why internal crises reoccur in the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood since the coup in 2013 until now, particularly the things we're going to focus upon right now, we need to regard the Muslim Brotherhood as an institution. In other words, the definition of institution in modern literature, it's a recurrent and constant pattern of a behavior. In an institution, we talk about values that dominate within a structure, a certain structure, not necessarily moral, not necessarily a specific code, but something that is normally regarded as the norm within that structure. So the Muslim Brotherhood may not feel comfortable in trying, when we try to implement or apply the terms of the Western terminology to their structures. But when we talk about power, we're not necessarily talking about coercive power, but the authority or having influence on people. So this is the power relation we're talking about, and also in institutional terms. The most important aspect is that it is concerned in understanding the informal power relations that are not uh, drafted in the internal regulations or the laws, but have become a well-known established foundation of the institution. The crisis I'm referring to, of course, when I talk about the crisis of the Muslim Brotherhood, many people think that the very project and the cause of the Muslim Brotherhood is in crisis. Is it still viable, or does it need to develop, to be developed? Is it still can it still be revived? And also, some people would think that it is a crisis of leadership, that the Muslim Brotherhood historically had a problem with leadership, but we are specifically talking about a very modern crisis or a very recent crisis, which is the subject of my paper, not because other crises are insignificant, but because this is our focus for today and because it is the manifestation of other crises, so to speak, in one way or another, which is specifically the crisis of division in the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the clashes between Mr. Ibrahim El Munir and also Dr. Mahmoud Hussein, and that caused a sort of a fissure in the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood that reaches in certain points very deep into the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood. We have two dimensions to the importance of this issue. First of all, I still believe the Muslim Brotherhood are a significant and important player in the political arena in Egypt, and they constitute an important party to the situation in Egypt over the past 8 years, 10 years. So uh, they the changes within the movement have implications for the future of Egypt as a whole. And also, the importance of this crisis emerges from the fact that this is probably the very first time since the early 1950s when the members of the Muslim Brotherhood tried to topple the guide or the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. So this is only the second instance in which we have such dissent within the Muslim Brotherhood. But this is a more critical point or a more critical crisis, since in the 50s the project of the Muslim Brotherhood was more crystallized, was present, had its organizations, institutions, and manifestations. So if there would be an attempt to uh, overthrow the leader of the movement, there would be structures to maintain the movement. But in the current status quo, there is no office of leadership in general, and the parts of the Muslim Brotherhood inside Egypt and outside Egypt are sort of detached because of the restrictions, and also the members of the Muslim Brotherhood, no matter how great in number they are unable to um, they do not they're not enough for a quorum according to the internal laws of the Muslim Brotherhood in order to take that decision. So the situation is only subject to de facto factors, and so who of those members or conflicting members have more popularity or has more influence on a larger number of members, and this only adds into the chaos within the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the question, when this paper was requested, the question was, is this conflict within the leadership? I'm going to the assumption or the presumption that it tries to depict the young people of the Muslim Brotherhood as a single unit and unified, homogeneous mass is inaccurate in the first place. So I believe there is a crisis, so to speak, in the very conceptualization of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the way people regard it, what people talk about since the Mubarak era, is that the young people are only involved in not in the leadership but in administrative youth activities and more lower ranking circles, but not in the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. But that doesn't mean in any way that they share the same perspective or vision for the future of the movement, or that they hold ideas that are restricted by age. I believe that any critical views held by the Muslim Brotherhood young people are shared by many in the older generation or the leadership or younger, etc. So they are part of the uh, struggle within, or the polarization, so to speak, between the ideas in the Muslim Brotherhood. So particularly that we do not have a declared representative to speak for the total mass of the young people affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. I believe Mr. Yasser attempted to do such a thing when he undertook a study about the crisis in 2016, but I'm not sure there is more literature that tried to examine the young people of the Muslim Brotherhood and talk about their orientations, whether in their vision to the solution or the future and outlook of the movement, and whether those ideas are only shared within the young generation or being circulated within the different ranks and generations of the Muslim Brotherhood. So since we have established it's not a generational problem, I would assume that there are three main reasons for exacerbating the existing crisis in the period post the coup, which have exploded over the past 2 months as well. The first reason is related to the external environment in which the Muslim Brotherhood operate, be it the Egyptian in context or even in exile when a critical mass of the movement moved to the exile. The second factor or reason is that this conflict is, or this dispute and disagreement is related to politics, to an approach to the solution. The third is definitely an administrative one, how the movement should be managed, how its leadership have to be selected, particularly those who are given professional or technical tasks rather than just points of reference, and how accountability is conducted at any level, and leadership or down in the hierarchy, and how to circulate the power within the movement so that people would not remain in the leadership for 20 or 30 years. So I believe those factors have interacted for the years after the military coup until they reached the current crisis. So the first factor related to the environment. Actually, Imam Hassan al-Banna, one of his achievements, one of his main achievements was the organization that he presented and established organization for the Islamic movement that can have looked at a document released by the CIA that describes the period after Abdel Nasser lifted the restriction on the Muslim Brotherhood, that within hours we had dozens or even hundreds of branches or sections of the Muslim Brotherhood have had gatherings and protests by the Muslim Brotherhood young people. So this document was describing how this movement, although it was under restriction or was proscribed for over a year, it was still able to uh, uh, mobilize its young people within hours. I, I always use an assumption as well that I believe it comes in handy, which is that the movement of the organization that was restructured since the beginning of the 70s was more established than the one established by Hassan al-Banna. So Hassan al-Banna established an association working in an open sphere. Its membership was open and declared, etc. When this movement was reorganized, it was reorganized to take into account that it was operating in a hostile environment and that it was targeted. and that it does not enjoy a legal status. So it requires a lot of discretion in terms of its internal affairs, the names of the members, how the leaders are selected, etc. This, as a result, this movement uh, became more centralized, and also this discretion on internal affairs made it always harder to have review or accountability mechanisms unless the leadership itself would review its performance or would hold to account one of its members. But that is not the dominant culture within the movement. The what It went well because the movement was achieving and accomplishing good accomplishments. So at the time, you would find that the movement was on the ascent. It would be the main party in the opposition against Mubarak. So this accomplishment on the level of the unions, on the parliament, etc., made the members, despite or disregard the reserve they had against the some of the policies, they still maintained their confidence in the general movement and the direction of that movement and the orientation of the movement. When the revolution started, the movement came into the revolution with the same organization, the same discretion, and the same internal organization culture, and it maintained that, although this was in contradiction with the general attitude of the people after the revolution, the openness, the transparency, the accountability. But what helped the movement continue the same culture was that it also was successful. It was able to win in the parliament, and all the political decisions it supported were they were capable of fulfilling them, etc., until they won in the presidency elections. But what happened afterwards, whether within the presidency elections or the blow with the coup put an end to that issue. All the muted questions that existed earlier exploded. Who's responsible for decision making? Who took that decision? How can he be held to account? If it was that person elected or selected on right grounds, on the grounds of competence and capability. So all of those earlier became very pressing. But the performance of the Muslim Brotherhood was not convincing after the coup, which only exacerbated this internal issue. So this lack of ability to deal with the suffering in detention centers, the migration of citizens, the lack of political vision or political program, all of this practically exacerbated the situation and the questions on accountability within the Muslim Brotherhood. And there was no leadership that was capable of convincing the Muslim Brotherhood or influencing the members in order to contain this controversy, because the whole leadership was almost, all of them were almost in prison. So, thus, the Muslim Brotherhood started to deal with what for them was a new leadership, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood outside Egypt, the people who were living outside Egypt for 20, 30 years before the revolution, and they would use the traditional, conventional organizational structure, which they have been familiar with, although at the time hundreds or thousands of members of the Muslim Brotherhood came with a different culture and a different set of priorities. So this difference in organizational culture led to a retreat or a drawback in the influence of the leadership on its own members. So the official stance or position declared by the Muslim Brotherhood leadership had no longer the same weight and the same binding authority on its own members. If you would look back to the Mubarak era, you would find that there is um, a sort of statement, a press release, but it was only enough to declare or to clarify any issue within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that statement by the leadership would be enough to put an end to all controversy because there was a trust in the capability of the movement in handling these issues. However, now the members are able to receive uh, messages from multiple sources with the telecommunication surge and the lack of trust. And also the other issue is related actually to trust. The members of the Muslim Brotherhood had complete trust in the project, that it was feasible, that it was had sound intentions, and that they had the great confidence in the institution and the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this was reinforced by their culture before the revolution, that they were the biggest Islamic party. They were a middle ground between extremism that used violence and takfir against the state, and also the Salafist movement that abstained from being involved in politics. They were the only party involved in the middle in the political life. So this instilled trust, but this trust was totally shattered with the military coup, and all of a sudden the Muslim Brotherhood started to question, are we really capable of achieving what we used to be able to? Are we really capable of governing this state? Is it bigger than we thought or grander than we thought? And also, there was another issue, which is isolation from the community, which was such a harsh situation because the Muslim Brotherhood has always operated in a sort of a compassionate constituency and a community for a protest for Al-Aqsa or in solidarity with Palestine. They would, for example, and when they would were chased down, they would seek refuge in any shop and they would be hidden by the regular citizens. But all of a sudden, they found themselves isolated and targeted by the citizens themselves, by the community. So their colleagues, co-workers, their neighbors would actually report on them, even those who benefited from the social and the charity work of the Muslim Brotherhood started to adopt a very antagonist attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood. And for the first time, they bought into the anti-Muslim Brotherhood propaganda promoted by the state. The people have never before believed it, and they believed their eyes. So that anti-Muslim Brotherhood propaganda did not have resonance with them when they were benefiting from the charity and from the community work that the Muslim Brotherhood was involved in. But this was not the case after the coup, and this affected the confidence and trust in the Muslim Brotherhood. The final factor that played into the current crisis was the issue of diaspora or exile. Uh, there have always been some members of the Muslim Brotherhood outside Egypt or abroad. They would be involved in dawah or away from, or they are living in expatriate countries and they are reside in those countries. But now the very structure of the Egyptian movement started to disintegrate into part in the exile and part inside Egypt, and that was a new situation for the Muslim Brotherhood. But most importantly, the community of the Muslim Brotherhood started to be more capable of learning more about its own self. So before the revolution, the Muslim Brotherhood was vertical in a way. There was a, a chain of communication uh, that went vertical from uh, top to bottom, but horizontal communication. If, for example, I am a student, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Al Mansoura University, there was no way through the organization to uh, communicate with someone from the University of Alexandria. So or the Brotherhood in Aswan or elsewhere. But in exile, all of a sudden, this became very easy. This horizontal, cross-generational communication became very easy. Of course, inside Egypt, that was restricted for security reasons. It would not be easy for me as someone from the Ahliya to go to someone in Cairo or elsewhere. That was a security question. But then the Muslim Brotherhood members, rank and file, started to be capable of communicating with their leadership on a daily basis. Also, on horizontal terms, the Muslim Brotherhood community discovered that they were diverse in themselves. They didn't have a unified outlook, a unified vision for the future. So the level of things that were regarded as fixed facts and taken for granted became much less. So it uh, turned out that they are more diversified than they thought. As a result, there was this density of communication and acculturation and exchange of information, as well as direct acquaintance with the leadership. So individuals would start to make their own assessments of the leadership if they are capable of running the current stage, and this would mobilize them into. So, all in all, those three factors and those changes in the environment, the impact it had on the trust, as well as the restructuring of the methods of communication between the different levels of the Muslim Brotherhood members all played into the internal crisis because it created some indicators, including more pressure on the leadership to change and more pressure on the leadership to provide answers to some of the political questions, and also uh, calling for more reform, internal reforms, and all of this in general, not the center of all of this was in Turkey because it was the most dynamic host community in which the Muslim Brotherhood could move and cooperate and communicate more properly, in addition to having uh, um, the majority of active leaders in exile in Istanbul. Unfortunately, the leadership, be it Dr. Mahmoud Hussein or the external exile leadership, did not accommodate or understand properly those pressures and that level of criticism or challenge to the leadership of the movement. So they did not succeed in making use of that situation. And when Mr. Ibrahim started as the general murshid, he made some suggestions that made it look like that he understood that we needed political accomplishment, we needed accommodation for members of Muslim Brotherhood. So when he started to be responsive, he ran into a clash with the uh, leadership.
The second reason that led to the differences is the political difference, and it's not about the political orientation. For example, no part of the leadership was saying that we will follow a revolutionist track without any reconciliation, or others who were saying that we will go to negotiations. No, there was no difference in or dispute on that aspect. The aspect was, or the difference was on whether shall we go through the political action or not, or shall we keep it dormant without making changes that might negatively impact us. This wasn't understood fully, and is still is why the Muslim Brotherhoods in the past 7 years they remained in such dormant way in in such a political environment. People are displaced outside Egypt. Egypt is now under a complete or fully fledged dictatorship, and the state, the approach of the state is completely apparent that they want to eliminate or there is a decision to eliminate the project of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhoods are dormant, which means there is no political initiative. There are some positions that were made sometimes in certain events, in the anniversary of the revolution, or when Trump came or Biden came. So they make a statement, but uh, when the people, or when the regime detained people or designated the group, the group remained silent. So there is a hypothesis which says that this was the position of the leadership. It was intentional, which means to go dormant and in the status quo, because there is an assessment and there is a regional project that is targeting the group. So it is not wise for us uh, to challenge this matter, and because this will put us under more targeting and fiercer challenges. So let's wait this storm to go away. I don't know how long, for 10 years or 20 years, only God knows. So I believe that the Muslim Brotherhood should have professional political leadership, a political decision that is based on vision and analysis. But the Muslim Brotherhood were hegemonizing the political decision, and other members didn't have any powers other than giving some advice or some suggestions, which made the majority of the figures of the Muslim Brotherhood are either left the Muslim Brotherhood, and they said that we are incapable to work inside the Muslim Brotherhood, or they are still within the Muslim Brotherhood, but they have no roles, they have no say. So the Brotherhood itself is not doing anything or any acts. These pressures led to the fact that it led to further internal disputes, and then we started to have a movement inside the movement, and they started to say that those people, the deputy supreme leader, started to say that we need to bring those back, and so there was the challenge that or the disputes happened again because some voices were saying that those people didn't want to be Muslim brothers anymore, and they challenged our opinion, so they should not come back to the group. There is another dimension which is understood. So there is internal pressure about selecting the leadership and how we can hold it accountable. The role of the shura councils, are they only electoral constituencies, or should they have a role in the making the strategic planning or the strategic policy of the group? The role of the youth, the role of women, especially that they are important groups within the Muslim Brotherhood, and they are, to some extent, they are marginalized. All of these issues faced the same culture that is deeply rooted within the group, which always suggested that they are still in the area which or in the period that was the pre-revolution period, which means that the same culture, which is obedient, complete obedience, should apply, and they consider that the leadership is capable of leading the group, and those members are incapable of having a say in the main objectives or the main issues of the group. So this is a well-rooted culture, and it led that uh, in general, that a large group of the leaders, they have a paternal approach, which means that they are more able to understand the interests of the group, and they can say what is good and what is wrong about the group, considering that other members are not well qualified to say anything. Right now, we have the main problem is in the administration, and this is because there is an understanding that no change can happen in the political position of the group, and there is no possibility to make any political change unless there is administrative change. Because in the past years, these changes were rejected by the group itself, and now it became a major part, or the top level of the Muslim Brotherhoods are willing and ready to make these changes, and this was accepted by a large group of the members, because if this administrative change succeeded, then other types of change are possible, will be more likely to happen. Now, uh, there is agreement that the administrators in of the top leaders, but there is no agreement on the political orientation afterwards. So what I mean is the agreement is that there should be a change, administrative change, and there should be accountability for the leaders and elections. However, it's not necessary. That means that after all of that, politically speaking, what orientation or what direction should we go to the right or to the left, for example? So if that administrative change took place, this will make the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood capable to adopt a more convincing political vision, and it will be more capable of avoiding the problems they are falling in. The final point, what will happen with the deputy supreme leader? Will Mr. Mahmoud will be back as a leader of the group, or what? This will depend on who will answer the correct questions, which means that in general, members of the Muslim Brotherhoods are not going to be inclined with a certain leadership based on that. They have a larger number of the Shura Council of that. For example, they control more media outlets. So now the leaders of the group are in race against time in order to convince the people around them, in order to make the group again capable to do political action to face the challenges that are ahead, and this will lead to produce leadership that can make decisions and that can make use of the human capital of the young people in the group and those who stopped doing any work in the past years. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا
Thank you,
أستاذ عمار.
Mr. Ammar, for
والحقيقة
your paper.
محاضرة غنية
It
بالمعلومات
is a rich
والأفادة.
lecture and
أستاذ
very
عمار في
informative
حديثه
and
أشاد
analytical. He
سيادة عن
started
استخدام
saying that
النصوص
the
القرآنية
differences in
للجماعات
any group is not easy,
المسلمين.
especially in a group like the Muslim
ومعظم
Brotherhood,
المحللين
because most
يتناولونه
analysts talk
بصعوبة،
about them as
لقلة
a black
المعلومات،
box
لأنه
because of
الجماعة
the
كانت متمسكة
scarcity of information,
لا
as the
سيما
group
في
is
تاريخها الحديث.
steadfast,
يعني بالنسبة
especially in
لأي
its
جماعة
modern
كما
history.
ذكرت
Speaking about these
تحتوي على
differences is
ثغرات،
limited because we
ولكي
have
نفهم
little
الأزمات
information
بصورة
about that,
مستمرة
and that's why
لابد
we don't.
من
In
النظر
order to understand why
للجماعات
the problems are repeated, we need
كمؤسسة
to have
عملت
analysis
بقوة
from
داخل
within.
الجماعة،
It is an institution. It
وكانت
has
قوية
power
التمييز
skills, and he didn't get in
والقاعدة
details of that, but
بالنسبة
it is
للجهات
important, and the
السلطوية
ability of moving
والإدارية،
people as well
خصوصا
as
في
the
الأطراف
moral and
غير الرسمية
the
للحزب
moral power and the
والجروبات
informal
الأعلام
force that
الشرسة
became a very important factor.
النظرية.
And maybe Mr.
السؤال
Tahir
الذي
will
كان مطروحا
add
عليه
to
هو هل
this.
ندرك
The
الإخوان
question that he
أزمة
has is the
الأزمة
crisis of
السعيدة
the
أم
Muslim
الأزمة
Brotherhood
الجيدة،
is the crisis of the project,
سواء كان
and
مؤقتا
is it still
تاريخيا.
active and does
فقال
any work in the future?
في تفصيله
He
أن
said
الأزمة هي
in
بين
what
طرفين،
he said that
المرشد
the
الأستاذ إبراهيم منير
crisis is
وبين
between Dr.
الأمين
Ibrahim
العام
Munir,
الأستاذ
the
حسني.
supreme leader,
الأزمة
and the
هنا لأنها
General
أول
Secretary
أزمة
Mahmoud Hussein.
تقع داخل
The
الإخوان
crisis,
منذ
because it is the first crisis that
وهي
happens
جزء
on the
من
first level,
المشكلة.
on the leadership
غياب
level, and this is
لكن جزء من المشكلة هو غياب القيادات
and
الأولى
part of
من
the
السلوك
problem is
هناك
the
الكثير
absence
حاضر
of
على حافة
some of
الخلافة
the first
مع
level
التمرد
leaders
والكيان
who are in the
الصهيوني
prisons,
والتجسس
and because there is no
والصراع
quorum
الداخلي
in order to
الأقلية.
solve this
أصبحت
problem
الأزمة
in
سببه
accordance with the
التأثير
bylaws.
والموارد.
And then we started
السؤال
to
الذي
have a
طرح
question of
في
the
هذا
power
الكتاب
and the
ما هذه
hegemony, and the
النقطة
question of
مهمة
the paper: is it
فقيادة
a
الإخوان
difference
الأخوان
between
شيء
generations
موحد
or not?
وغير
And I will, and the
انتشر
paper
ولكنها
suggests
قديمة
that
منذ أيام
this is
مبارك
not
وليست جديدة.
the analysis from this
الثورة
aspect is not
وهي عدم
correct. There is a
وجود
problem
جمهورية على
with
مستوى القيادة،
or a
ولكن لا
crisis
يعني
because
أنها
the
أفكار
youth
موحدة.
are not
الرؤى
in
النقدية التي
the
تنتشر
leadership, but it doesn't
وتقال
mean
أن
that they
كثير من
have the
الإخوان
same
يناضلون
paper.
دفاعا
And
عن
the
الأجندة.
criticism or the critique
الرؤى
that the
النقدية
youth have
بصراحة
is
معروفة،
present
هناك
among
أولويات
some of
فيها
the older
تقسيمات مدروسة
generations. So there, it's present in the
وتقال أنها
literature,
قد
and he
أخذ
mentioned
ياسر
one of the papers by
المشكلة
Mr.
هو
Yasser
أنه
Fathi, one of the commentators in this issue,
لا
and
يفهمون
he said that it's
هناك
not
أزمة لا شك، وهناك
a crisis amongst generations, but
أزمة
there is a
وهنا
crisis.
متعلقة
And he mentioned
بالجماعات التي فيها
reasonment in
الأغلبية
which the
السياسية بعد انتخابات
group is working,
2013،
especially that after
وأصبح
2013, a
هناك
lot of
ضغط
people
أمني.
are in the
الأمر
prison. The
الثاني
change in
هو
environment is very important.
الذهاب
The
إلى
other thing, it
السياسة
has to do with
والحل
the
لهذه الأزمة.
politics and the
والثالث
solution of
درء
the
سبب
crisis. And the third
أنه
one,
كيف
as he
يمكن
mentioned,
أن
was an
تدير الجماعة
administrative
نفسها
problem,
وتنظر
which
إلى
means
نفسها
how the
وتحاسب كل
Muslim
فرد
Brotherhood can lead
بذاته.
itself and hold its leaders accountable and find the solutions for the problems. All of these, or the
فهذه الأحزاب
collaboration or the collective
الثورية
of these problems create the
فعالة
current
وقادرة على
crisis.
تشكيل النظام
One of the aspects or the crisis showed that
السيئة كما
the
ذكرت.
organization
كيف
is
استطاع
still
الإخوان أن
active
يعيدوا
to
توظيف
mobilize
القوات
people,
المسلحة
and he mentioned a paper
بعد
developed by the
بدون
CIA that how
أمر
the
فيهم.
Muslim
وهذا
Brotherhood
يؤدي إلى ما يعني
managed to
كتلة
mobilize
مسلحة
the youth
تنهزم.
within hours,
وقال
which means
هناك
that they still
فرضية
have that
قانونية
capacity.
للمواليد
And he
المنظمة في
said that
السبعينات
There is a hypothesis that the organization that was reorganized in the 70s and the 80s is stronger than the one that was established by Hassan al-Banna, and but it's not reviewed unless the group itself wants to do that, which means that there is no that culture within the organization, especially that it was in the rise, in the political rise and the achievements they were making. So it's covered on the problems, especially when they had achievements in the syndicate and the trade union and the students' unions. And it continued with the same structure, and that was contradicting with the periods of the revolution, which called for accountability, transparency. But again, because they made achievements in the elections, this covered all these problems. What happened in 2013 and then the relapse of the experience showed these problems. After that, also the bad performance of the group after the getting into governance made it impossible to solve these problems, especially that most of the leaders are in prisons, and some people and some of the young people are talking more about that, and the leadership doesn't have the same control that they had before, which means that the internal discourse didn't have the same impact as the past. The other reason, the lack of a trust. Before the revolution, there was a huge trust in the leadership and their Islamic goals, but after the revolution, this trust was shaken, especially that they felt that they are isolated from the community, and that was a shock that even the social groups, that or societal groups that were benefiting from the movement, now they became an enmity with them, and they are they believe what the media of the government says about them. The other point is that we have some of the members or a lot of the members outside, but they didn't affect that because it was a vertical relation uh, in the group and not a horizontal one. But after the leadership or most of the leadership were in the prisons, now it became more easier to have a horizontal, and that led to more flow and liquidity of information and information exchange amongst the different groups. So the environment also had a lot of impact on the internal environment, leading that the leadership is convinced to make changes within the group. This was clearer in Turkey, where most of the leaders are there. The leaders couldn't understand, especially the Secretary General Mahmoud Hussein, couldn't understand this issue. But when Dr. Ibrahim Munir got into office, some people felt that he understood the crisis, especially and when he made some calls, the confrontation started. The speaker says that there is no difference on, or there is difference on the difference was not on the vision, whether do we want a political action or not. The difference was even beyond that. Do we indeed want to have a political action or not? And there is a huge change now in Egypt. Egypt is now under a fully-fledged dictatorship that wants to eliminate the entire project of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is still dormant. And some people believe that it is intentional, this dormant method, because the group is weak and they don't want to confront more, especially under a regional project. So, and others who have different voices within the group, they are either silent within the group or they left the group. For example, the deputy general guide Ibrahim Munir wanted to have others, and that was another aspect of the confrontation. The third point, which is the administrative dimension and the role of the Shura councils, the role of women and youth, because they are important groups, but they are marginalized because the leadership consider itself the only one capable of taking decisions, and that everybody else should observe and obey. And now this is the title of the crisis, because the political vision cannot be changed without this administrative change. So this is the headline now, and it's became the point that has the confrontation. So if we have this change in leadership and in the administration, other changes might happen. So there is a suggestion that when we do that, there can be discussion about the political orientation. There is a question that he said, where would this dispute lead? He said that this dispute between Mahmoud Hussein and Ibrahim Munir will be decided when certain questions can be answered by the two parts from the members of the group to see to which side they are going to be inclined to. Thank you very much for your paper. And now the second paper, which will be presented by Dr. Mr. Shadi Ibrahim. The title of the paper is the type of the organizational structure and its impact on decision making.
السلام عليكم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
Hello,
الصوت واضح كده
peace be upon you. Do you hear me well?
طبعا يعني كان جزء كبير من يعني اللي كان خلاني اشتغل على الورقة دي
A
اشتغلت
large
عليها
part of the reason why I developed this paper or wrote this paper, of course, I worked on it on
كده الصوت واضح
different phases.
طيب ده يعني كان جزء كبير من يعني الورقة دي اشتغلت
So
عليها
the reason
كذا
behind
مرة
working on this
بشكل
paper,
منتظم
I worked on it several times in
وكان ده
different
خلاني
periods.
ان
And
انا
the reason behind
اسأل
that
سؤال
has always been that I'm
الأزمة اللي
asking
احنا شفناها في
the
الثورة
question about the crisis that we have
الفريق
seen
العام
in the
للجماعة
revolution,
والحشد
about
الثوري المتمولة
on
في
how
2011
the group worked with the
كان
revolution
في
or
أخطاء
acted
كبيرة بتحصل
upon the revolution in
وحدث
2011. And we have seen a lot
تطور
of
كبير
mistakes
جدا في
in dealing with the
التعاطي
revolution, and there was
مع
also
الثورة
slow pace in dealing with it,
يعني
especially
نقطة
when
ذهنية
we talk about the revolution,
كان
or the
بيتطلب
revolution is a
تركيز
fast type, and
وكتير
it requires
في طريقة
focusing and the
يعني
clarity
التصدي
and
معاها أو
as well identification
يعني
of
التصدي
the
بشكل
groups
عام
that you are going to confront, or
فالحقيقة
the regime that you're
لما
going
رجعت
to confront.
للبنية التنظيمية
So when I
كان
went back to
في
study the organizational structure of the
مصطلح
Muslim
اللي هو حركة
Brotherhood,
الجماعة
I
ان
saw
احنا ما ينفعش ان احنا نجيب
that
يعني
it's not
نقيس
correct
نقيم الجماعة
to
من ناحية قانونية او من ناحية لائحية وان احنا نشوف
to
المؤسسة
evaluate the
التنظيمية
group of in
هي
terms of its
هي
bylaws,
اساسا
and to
قوية
see if the
تستوعب
legal organizational
فيها
structure is
وحدات
strong or not, and
يعني وحدات في الإدارة كبيرة وتشمل اتساع جغرافي
and
وأقسام
to
فنية فمعنى
see
إن هي
that if
مؤسسة
they have
مش شرط إن
widespread
هو
different
يعني
departments and technical departments, it means it is a
جماعة
strong
قوية
group. It
فالجماعة ممكن تكون
doesn't
قوية
mean that it
في
is a
الظاهر
strong. It
بالظبط
could be
لكن
strong
تكون
in one
بتواجه مشكلة
aspect, but from other aspects, it suffers from a problem. So the
الإدارة عليها هو
methodology that
المؤسسية الكبيرة
we can
اللي بدأت
work on
من
is
أول السبعينات وبعد
the
كده نفعل
methodology
أكتر
that started to
بدراسة
appear in the beginning of the 70s, which
أساسيات
is
المؤسسة
more,
وإن
which
إحنا
studies more the
نحقق
performance of the institution.
تقييم مؤسسي
And
فنيا من
when
ناحية
we
قانونية
do
بس
evaluation of the
مزدوجة
institutions, it's not correct to
وهنحتاج إن إحنا
assess them
نقيم
only
دي
legally, because it is
بأحداث
at the end, it's not
وهنحتاج
a
إن إحنا
state
ننظر
institution.
لتقييم
When we evaluate
الأفكار
groups, we evaluate
المؤسسة
the values and the
ومستوى
ideas
سلوك
of
الأفراد
the
المشاركة
party or that group, as
والأحداث
well as the ideas of the individuals who are leading this group or
الزوايا
this
الكبرى
party.
مهمة
These
جدا
2 points are
في
very
إن إحنا
important: the institution
لما نيجي في أي اتجاه
and
نتعاطى
its
إزاي مع
ideas,
الأحداث
in what
يعني
directions it is direction is it going, and how it is
التقييم
reacting to
دايما
events. For example, even
بيكون
for the Americans, when they
افتراضي
want to
وبيسمي ده
evaluate
صنع
any
قرار
organization, they evaluate the people
كأفراد
who participated or
بجانب
contributed to
تقييم
making the
الأفراد
decision of making of in this the
فاحنا
organization,
محتاجين
in
نقيم
addition to
الافراد وعن ده اللي خلانا
the
نعمل
state
سيمبوزيوم طب
itself.
احنا
And
مين
that
الجهات اللي
made
المفروض
me
تقوم بصنع هذا
uh,
القرار في جميع الشؤون
follow this approach to see
ولقيت ان
who are
المفروض
the
يكون
individuals
عندنا
who are
مؤسستين
making the decisions. And I
مؤسسة
found that we have
الانتخابات
2 institutions.
ومجلس الشورى
We have the
لما رجعت
guidance office and the Shura Council.
للتصور اللائحي والقانوني
When I looked into the bylaws development and the regulations of the group, I found 13 changes, but also there was a paper that was issued by the
واحد
incentive or motivation group, which
إن
found 15, 14 or 15 amendments or changes.
سنة
In, 2000,
1933
in
ضابط
1935,
الإرشاد بقى ليه صفة
the
وجود هيكلي ومؤسسي في
the
الجمعية.
guidance office started to have a presence and
1937 وقع عليه
institutional
لوائح
structure
بتنظم
in the group,
الجمعية
and then
المكتب
in the
هو المحاور ليه.
1960s
من أول
there
38
was
لغاية 54
it has a place in the organizational
الجمعية
structure.
بتستوعب أعداد كبيرة جدا
Before
من
that, it was, or at that
من
point in time, it was a
فيها
very large group and it was
يعني
accommodating large
مختلفة
groups of students in
بتجمع
different
الأفراد
provinces
نفسها
from different
تنظيميا
groups. So the organization was
وإرشادا
improving itself
للنظام
organizationally
في لحظة كده
with the
حصلت
increasing
في تاريخ
numbers. But
الجماعة
there
هي
was
لحظة
a point
اغتيال مؤسس
that
الجماعة
was a
حسن البنا.
change. That point was
ودي
the
كان يعني أول
assassination
إنهاء للجماعة
of Hassan al-Banna, the
الإسلامية.
creator or the founder of the group.
والغريب إن
So
الجماعة بدل ما
the
يعني
strange
تصعد
thing
حتى
is that
تنظيم أو
instead
إداريا
of having
في
someone from
الهيئة
within the
المعنية
guidance office
بالقرار
or
في
from
إدارة
the
الجماعة،
committee that is
بدأ
related to make
هذه
decisions within
الهيبة
the group, they brought someone who
زي
is
الجماعة اللي هو
completely
حسن الهضيبي
outside the
واختاروه
organizational structure,
بحكم
who was
علاقة
a judge,
شخصية
and
وهكذا يعني.
because there was a personal
والمصادر اللي بتتكلم
relationship.
عليها منها
And that's what
يوسف
I read in
القرضاوي
the
اتكلم عن النقطة دي.
sources. Yusuf
برضه
Qaradawi,
في
for example, talk
المؤرخين
about that. And so he was
واختاروا
from outside the organization, and they
للإرشاد.
made him the head
وبالتالي
of the guidance office.
يعني حسن الهضيبي جه
So Hassan
من
al-Hudaybi
خلفية مختلفة
came
خالص
from a
عن
completely
خلفية
different
الجمعية.
background from the structure of
هو
the
شخص
group. He
ليه
is a
ملتزم
legal
بطريقة
person.
مؤسسية معينة،
He
ونهج
is committed
مؤسسي
to a
معين داخل
certain
المؤسسة الجمعية.
uh, organizational structure
فبالتالي
within the
هو
judiciary in the
كان
state,
أكتر
and a certain
ناحية سياسية
institutional
ومتعاطي
structure.
مع
So he couldn't understand the
الفواعل
political
سواء في المشهد
interaction
الداخلي أو في
and
المشهد
how to interact with the
المشهد
different
الخارجي.
actors
حسن
in the whether
كان
in the
رافض
region or inside
معاقبة
Egypt.
ضد
So, for
الإرهابيين
example, Hassan
والإرهابيين
al-Hudaybi
في
created
فلسطين
the special
ومدد للمسلمين
organization within the
من
organization to
أول
deal
حاجة
with
كان
the
بيساعد حاجة
English
اسمها إعادة التنظيم،
colonization.
حتى كمان
There is something that we need to understand, that there is
يعني
nothing that
دخل
can
في
be
خلاف
extra
بعد
legal.
اعتقال
Uh,
كان في عرض من جمال عبد الناصر بخروج
and even,
الجماعة
for example,
وطلب إن
after,
هو القرار
for
لازم
example,
يكون يعني يعني صادر من مؤسسة قضائية.
when there
ففي
was
بعض
a
الناس
pardon that
السياسيين
was made by Jamal
المشكلة
Abdel
وجود
Nasser, he
دايما
rejected that,
بيلجأ
and Hassan al-Hudaybi, and said
للدستور،
that the pardon should be
وده
coming
أفقد
from a judiciary
الفاعلية
entity.
والتعاطي مع
So, having a person from
المؤسسة
outside the
الجمعية.
organization and not understanding the
وكانت نقطة
political
الخلاف
aspect or the
الأكبر
political dimension of the group made it
بعد
weaker
طبعا
politically.
الجماعة تعرضت لقمع
The group, of
الاقتصادي
course, was under a lot of
ومعظم الأفراد
oppression
من
and
جماعة الإخوان.
uh,
في بداية عهد
persecution.
السادات من أول يعني
Under
71
Sadat,
بدأ يعني
from
حصل
1971 to
تواصل ما بين
1975,
الجماعة وما بين السادات
there was a
في
kind of
جلسات، وبدأ
communication between the
معتقل
Brotherhood
السادات
and
في
Sadat,
السجن لغاية ما صدر
which
العفو
led
العام في
to the
75.
release of some of the leadership from prisons until the
في
1975
يعني
pardon or amnesty that was issued.
أعضاء الجماعة اللي خرجوا من السجن
Members of the Muslim
آه،
Brotherhood who were released from
بدأوا
prison
يعيدوا تأسيس
started
التنظيم
to
من أول وجديد،
re-found
وكان في بناء
the organization
كان
once again
ورثات
with
الجماعة كان إرث
the
جيد
heritage
أخلاقيا
that the
ماشي.
Muslim Brotherhood had.
خلينا
The
نتكلم
heritage was
اللي ساعد
positive that
الجماعة مثلا
helped the
إيه،
organization to
الحكومة
include
السابقة
the youth
قدرت تستوعب
from the students' movements, and at the same time,
الشعب عشان
it
كده
managed
أول ما
to
حصل
accommodate
الانتخابات
a good
في منطقة
percentage of the
الساسي في
people.
مكان ما بدأ أخد
So
وقت
when there were
ياخد
elections,
بس شوية
they
أصوات قليلة
managed
في الفترة
to
الأخيرة اللي هي في عهد
uh,
مبارك. لكن
get
خلينا
votes
نقول إن اللي بدأ
since the days of Mubarak. But
يعني
let's say
خرج
that
عندنا اتنين
what
اتجاهين أو
we
تيارين
started to
داخل
have
مكتب الإرشاد أو داخل
uh,
الجمعية. التيار اللي
two
هو
currents within
التيار
the
الوسطي هو
guidance office in
اللي
the
بيكره
Muslim Brotherhood. The
الدكتور
first one
عصام
was the one that included Mr.
العريان،
Abdel Munem Abu
والمجموعة
Futuh
بشكل أساسي اللي هم
and, and Al Aryan.
يعني منفتحين منفتحين على العمل العام،
In general, they were
ومزيد من
open to
الحركة في
the
يعني
public
مزيد من
work, and they
الرفاهية
had a credits
الاقتصادية
of
في
activity within the
الشباب.
student movement
ودول بشكل أساسي كانوا منفتحين
and the
في
syndicates,
يعني
and they were open
الاتساع مع التفاعل مع
in
الجماهير.
terms of dealing with the
التيار الآخر
and
هو
interacting with
اللي
the
هو العنصر
audience in
الأمني
general.
يطلق عليهم هو القطبيين.
The
هم
others
أكتر
that are
مجموعة
called the Qutbis,
يعني
this group
يعني متبنين لأفكار
is
القطبية، لكن هو مصطلح أطلق على المجموعة اللي هي
it doesn't mean that they are or
65.
they adopt the ideas of Sayyid Qutb, but because they were detained in the 70s, including Muhammad Azzat, and he is
وبالتالي
one
دايما
of the
كانوا دايما في صدام
he was one
مع
of the
بعض،
members. So there was always
في دايما في التطور الأحداث السياسية.
confrontation between these two
مثلا زي
lines
يعني
in
عمار
interacting
بيقول
with any
على
political
التنظيم بعد
action.
السبعينات
Action.
ليه نمط
Ammar said that
كده، إن
after
هو
70s,
مجموعة محمود عزت عرفت تأسس
the group of
التنظيم
Mahmoud Azzat was able
وتشكله
to
بشكل
establish the organization
مستوحى
and
على
understand
النظام
its
السابق.
structure that is taken
فكانت بتاخد
from
نفس
or
نمط النظام القديم
quoted
في
from
الهيكلية،
the
لكن مش شرط
special
إن هي
organization. So
تستمر
it took
نفس
the same structure, but not
الفكر
necessarily
في
adopted the same
في
ideology
العنف او في المبادره بالعنف، لكن عرفت تاسس
in terms of
نظام
violence
خاص
or initiating violence,
وله
but
مرونة كبيرة إن هو
it had
يتغير مع
that
الضربات الأمنية اللي دايما
flexibility to deal with
بيئة
the
الوجود.
security attacks against them, which happen in different periods in
كان جزء
Egypt.
من حتى الضربات الأمنية
Part of
للمظاهرات
the
كانوا بيستهدفوا
security
الصحافة
attacks that
بالتحديد،
the
ما كانوش
regime
بيستهدفوا
made,
الجماعة وخلاص.
they
يعني حتى أثناء
targeted
قسم البرد
specific people
الجماعة لم يتم استهدافهم، إن هو في الآخر النظام كان
by the
بيعمل
regime,
فايدة بتعود عليه
because the regime, for example, would
كمستفيدين هو
assess the
بعض
benefit
المناطق المهمشة الحقيرة
from, for example, the regime wouldn't attack
القرى الحقيرة أو في المناطق
the
الفقيرة
aid department
بالنسبة
within the Muslim
للمناطق
Brotherhood,
الأمنية
because
المحلية.
the Brotherhood, the
فهو دايما
state,
حتى لما بيجي
thought
يستهدف
that
بيستهدف أشخاص محددين
it is
ويدور
helping the state in some of the marginalized areas. So
وفي
they were
نفس الوقت هو
targeting
كان ليه دور في
specific
إن
people
هو
and not everyone, or not the group as per
يعني
se. And this
بيواجه الأنظمة
also,
بشكل أو بآخر من الخارج. يعني كان في
and the
انتخابات
regime was
2009
leading the
هو مسك دكتور
organization
خيرت
to
شاكر
some
مسؤول
extent from outside. So, for
لمنشآت
example, in
إسلامية وضربها في
2009,
السجن
the Abu al-Futuh
وكان
was released from
موجود
Al-Qasr al-Aini
في
prison,
في القصر
and
العيني، وكان ساعتها مقر
Al-Qasr
الحكومة
al-Aini
كان
at the
موجود في
time
المدينة.
was the place where
وكان موضوع غريب
of
جدا
the
وغير مفهوم
leadership office or the
ان
guidance
هو
office of the
حصل
Muslim Brotherhood. So he was released and he
انقلاب
was
بالكامل
allowed
عليه
to
في
participate
2009
in the
لما
elections.
الاشخاص
So that
الموجودين في
was a
السجن لما
change
بيطلعوا
in the bylaws, or in the regulations,
بيستمروا في
which
حكم
means that
كقيادات
or in the bylaws of the Muslim Brotherhood, that people who are released from a prison can participate
لكن
in the
ده
leadership
مؤشر ان
of
هو
the Muslim
السجون
Brotherhood.
كانت
This is a
بتتعاقب مع
question, of
التغيير
course,
اللي
but
حصل
this shows us how the security apparatus in
اللي هو
Egypt
كان
deals
سجن
with the group and how they benefited from
رغم ان هو بعد كده
from these
النظام
things.
استبعده من انتخابات
Then
الرئاسية.
the regime, of course, excluded
لكن
him from the presidential elections. However,
يعني لما نشوف البنية
when we see
الديموغرافية
the
لمجلس الشورى
demographics of the Shura
حوالي
Council,
56%
we will see that about
منهم من سكان المدينة
56% are from the
30%
Delta,
من القاهرة ومن
21 are
وسط
from
البلد
Cairo and Alexandria, and 17% are from the Upper Egypt.
وفي مكتب الإرشاد
In the guidance
18%
office,
من الدقهلية
18% were
و18%
from
البحرية
from Al-Bahriya, 18% from
والأعضاء
Al-Sharqiyya,
الموجودين في مكتب
and
الإرشاد
some different area in
السوري
the
في كل
guidance
منطقة
office.
وكل
So
إقليم
the performance of each region or each
نمط
province
مختلف أو
has a different style
بنية يعني
from the
مثلا
other region, which means
سكان القبائل الموجودة
the
في سيناء ليها نمط
people or
هادئ
the
في
tribes in
التعاطي مع
Sinai have a
مع
very
جهات الأمن
sharp
العام، وهي
dealing with the
بيسكتوا
security
بهدوء.
personnel
لكن
in general, and they
سكان
never
مثلا
bend
المدن
to it.
القاهرة
Whereas,
والإسكندرية
for example,
عندهم خبرة في
people of
الملاحة
the Al
والجيش
Cairo and
والجندي
Alexandria,
مع
they have a
متوسط الفشل
flexibility and
السكاني.
how to deal with the different
مثلا
political
في الدلتا أغلب
changes
الناس كانوا
quickly. People from the Delta, for example,
زراعة
they have
وكانوا
because they
متمسكين
are
بنظام شرعي كبير، فكانوا
agricultural
فكرة
people.
الاستقرار
So the issue of stability and their connection with the land is completely different. People from the upper side, their performance, for example, or their behavior, you can see that they are sharp in even dealing with the regime in general. So the regime always tries to make strike balance with the families of the upper Egypt in order to have representatives from the different families in order to absorb any problems that may arise with those families. In 2013, the uprising or the demonstrations took place in the Upper Egypt. They were very fierce, and we can say that the regime lost control of the region of the Upper Egypt completely, whereas the Delta area, which includes the largest part of the Muslim Brotherhood, before even acting, most of the offices of the Muslim Brotherhood were, or most of the cards of the Muslim Brotherhood were burnt, and they didn't want to confront. So here I'm talking about the larger picture of the group. There is another point. If we look at the common points of the people or the groups that left the Muslim Brotherhood, and we can see that most of them had uh, a lot of activity within the student groups, or they had some action or some work within the political office of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is a question mark because most of the defectors were either from the political office, or they had a lot of activity within the syndicates or trade unions and the doctor syndicate or the lawyer syndicate, etc., etc. Or if they were members of the political committee and they had a role in their work. Even some technical committees had a lot of young people. But when we look at the average age of the young, we see that they are the guidance office. The average age of people in the guidance office are 88 years old, and this is a huge a problem. We're not talking about people who are 50 years, 60 years, or 50s. They are 88 years. This is the average age of the members of the guidance people. There was another paper that was talking about the point of the generational gap within the Muslim Brotherhood, which says that, and it is based, and it says that the group or the Muslim Brotherhood depends basically on the older people, and because, of course, of the security assault from them, that it allows some the members in Cairo to meet, and there were exceptional decisions that were made. This was used to make some actions within the organization, and that made them to feel more comfortable with relevance, with relatives and with people who are trustworthy. And that led to a behavioral change that, for example, so many people from the Muslim Brotherhood would not marry someone from outside the Muslim Brotherhood for the issues of trust. And that led to the issue of inheritance. So, because of the issue trust, so we see people who are the sons of someone of the old members there, and that we can depend on them for the issues of all the actions within the organization. This is natural, of course, because of the security pressure. But after the openness and after the revolution, there was a huge problem in dealing with this openness and revolution. Breaking this pattern, of course, will take time. It's not easy to break it. And for example, we have commonalities with the Al Wasat Party and the Egypt, the Revolution Party, and they were members from the youth who were Muslim Brotherhood and defected from the group, were members of these issues, and they were part of the students movement, like for example Abu Ula Madi and the Strong Egypt Party. They were some of the parts
من أول 2003 لغاية 2010
of the
كل
student movements
الجماعات
that
الموجودة
started from
العربية والإسلامية
2005 and
كانت في
even in
البدايات وكانت
2010. Most of the young people in
عمل
our
بطولات
in
وعمل
the
إعلانات
leading
للجامعات
positions, they had activity within the student groups
مع أحداث
at
الثورة
in these
كان
periods.
في نمط سريع جدا وكان في بعض
With
قيادات
the revolution, there was a fast
بتتولى
pace, and we
إطلاق
started to see some leaders who
والنمط
started to be in the leadership of
يعني
the
السياسة
group.
الجماعة تبنت سياسة إطفاء الحرائق
The group depended
وكانت
on the
بتتكلم
policy
عن
of extinguishing
الشباب اللي هو
fires and dealing with
خايف إن
the
هي تدخل
incidents that
تندمج فيه
they were afraid to get involved in
فيحصل
the
انتماء
incident in order
فكانت
not
تتناول
to
إن هي نسلك أأمن
have
الطرق
any
وأكثر الطرق
repercussions,
الشرعية والقانونية في التعامل
So
مع
they
taking
started
the best
using the
legal
approach,
ways.
ده
using the
يعني
safest
ده دايما بيخلينا نرجع
and
ان هو
calmer
النمط بتاع البنية التنظيمية في فترة من أول حسن وهضيبي رسخ لفكرة
way in
عدم المواجهة
dealing with
والنظام
those
وعدم التفاعل مع
things
النظام
as they
وكان
emerge, and they started to
يعني
not
أساليب فيها
confront
تنازل
the regime and use
تبادل
methodologies or
تعاون
approaches in which they are avoid
في حين الثورة كانت
confrontation.
في الأساس
While the
يعني
revolution
مواجهة للنظام
was successful because it
الثورة
confronted the regime. The
كانت
revolution
بالنسبة
was
للفترة
successful in the fact that the
أولى
young
وأحداثها
people
كانت
went to the
إن
took
الجماهير
to the
تنزل
streets
بأسرها
and
وتفرض رأيها
broke the aura around the
فهي
state
يعني
and
أنا أظن
encouraged
إن هو
other
من بعض
people
القيادات
to
الهائلين
join
اللي
the
كانوا
ranks of the
بيحافظوا على الثورة
revolution
أساسا
to
هم
overthrow
الأمراء
the
في
regime.
الثورات اللي بتحصل
So
2005 ما
the
كانوش مستوعبين
Muslim
إن
Brotherhood at the
النظام
beginning did not
هيهدد النظام
realize
ويقع
that
وينتهي
those
النظام فيه
protests were different from what happened, for example, in
يعني
2005. They
فالجماعة
thought
تبنت نمط
they didn't
صاعد
realize that the regime was about
فالفلسفة
to fall.
الأساسية في
So
خلق أي قرار
the movement
عندها حرص على الحفاظ على التنظيم
continued
بشكل
to
بشكل
uphold the
أساسي
organization and its own survival at
في
any
حين ان احنا نشوف
cost.
الشباب اللي كانوا جوه الثوره
While the young
لما
people
حصلت
in the
زي
movement,
يعني
in
المظاهرات اللي حصلت في
the protests
2011
in
ثوره
20
2011
in the revolution of
اغلب اللي
2011,
شاركوا فيها
most of
حتى لو
those
كان
who
في هل
participated
الجماعه
in
طلعت قرار
those
بالمشاركه ام ما طلعتش
protests,
قرار هل في
there was a question
اقسام
whether
قوه
the Muslim Brotherhood has
اتفتحت
issued a
للعموم اللي عايز يشارك
decision
يشارك
in
في
taking
اقسام لا
part in the
احنا هنلغي
revolution or not, or was there any
لكن ما كانش في
departments
قرار
within the
كبير
movement
مسبوق
who
بالمشاركه
took that decision and others who
وبالتالي
refrained? All
يعني
in
كل
all, there
سبب
was no high-ranking
بقاء
decision by the movement as a whole
بسبب
to take
الضربات
part,
الأمنية
and that
فمش
was
مدي فكرة
probably because
مساحة
of the
كافية لإدارة
security
الثورة بالشكل الصحيح
concerns
والملائم
which
يبقى دايما اتخاذ
hindered
الثورة
the
قرار
Shura
مبني على
process
دعم
in the
أقوياء وضعيف
consultation for decision making
فالشباب كان
and made it
عندهم فكرة
within a
المبادرة
narrow
في
circle
التعاطي مع أي
within the
حدث
Muslim Brotherhood.
كان
So
لهم دور
young
كبير جدا
people
في إنجاح
had the
حركة المظاهرات
initiative
وفي
in
وقف
taking part in that
الدم
revolution and
وفي بعض
playing a
الحاجات
vital role in the
تبدأ
success and victory of
في
the
مساحة
revolution,
أوسع
including in Al Jamal battle, in the camel
وبالتالي
battle,
التأكد
where after
وبناء
which we
عليها
started to see
يعني
those young people and
18
members of the Muslim Brotherhood
كمان ان هو
when they started to meet and
في اتفاق
consult
ضخم جدا
and
في صحن
discuss.
الرئاسة
And this
وبالتالي كمان اللقاء
also
في الاخر
uh,
حسني مبارك او
ended with the meeting with Omar Suleiman with the
الثوره
implicit
وحصل
agreement
انتصار
that the Muslim Brotherhood would
ان
not
هم
run for
يعني
presidency. So
نقطه فارقه
President
وبالتالي
Mubarak
حصل
or Mubarak
بشكل او باخر
withdrew and the military institution came
2015 بعد الانتخابات
forward
الرابعه
after the
الانتخابات
Rabi'a
كان تقريبا
sit-in was
ضرب مأثر
dismantled, I believe that the
وبقى
Muslim Brotherhood was
عندهم
given
فرص خلل في
a
تعاطي مع
killing,
الثوره
a doom
لكن
strike
ان الحركه
or
الوطنيه
a
في
deadly
خلال
blow.
اسبوع
But
عرفت
within
تستعيد
a
نفسها
week,
وتنظم
the
نفسها
movement was able
وتكون هي
to
بتقود مشروع
reorganize and
الوطن
restructure itself and take the lead on the ground.
وده سببه
And
بشكل
this is
اساسي ان هو
due
الفاعليه ان هو
basically to
ارتياحيه في التعاطي مع
the
الاحداث
uh,
بشكل اسرع وفي مبادره
efficiency in
في
dealing with
في
the
تبني سياسه الشباب
developments and
وفي
the
العمل
initiative
على
that started to emerge in
مع النظام
developing their
وكان في الاخر
approach
النتائج
to the regime
وراء
and
رد
its
الفعل
policies,
النتائج
although
سياسات
it
الجماعات اللي
remained
شفتها قبل كده
within the
لكن
realm
بيدينا
of
مؤشر ان
reaction to those developments. But this was still an indicator that with the change of generations, although we had the change of ideas, as my colleague Ammar mentioned, the ideas were not necessarily shared in common, but the young people were able to be more flexible in their reaction and and more resilient. Um, so in also the events of Muhammad Mahmoud Square and also the decision to take part in the presidential elections, it was mainly because they wanted to become part of the legal process of democratic transformation. And since the parliament has been dissolved, then we can make up for that loss through the executive authority, although the opportunity was still open to restore the parliament by making use of cooperation with the executive branch and the public opinion and to present it to the constitutional or higher court, the Supreme Court, but this did not happen. This argument was made that we will try to put the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood in the picture, despite the against the will of the military council. But the decision ultimately was they didn't want to confront the judicial system, although the situation and the opportunity was ripe actually at the time. The final point I wanted to discuss in order to, uh, in a nutshell, to talk about the issue of duplication or the overlap between the consultation, the shura within the leadership, and the body within the Muslim Brotherhood that inspects the new members. This overlap between those functions, which should be separate from one another, was confusing. You would find that there is a number of people or an individual who plays the three functions, and this was very problematic, particularly in the groups of the young people of Muslim Brotherhood, where they decided to, after the revolution, to start a political party, although the decision was not completely adopted. I believe by this I have concluded my paper, and I am aware that some of the ideas I've proposed or discussed are a bit confrontational, so to speak, but I welcome any questions. Thank you, Mr. Shadi. He started speaking, talking about this study, having covered the period after the revolution, after he recognized that the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood was slow to interact with the events and developments of the revolution. So he started to develop, to study the movement, not from a legal perspective, but that's not to undermine its strength, and that this movement would be evaluated by the individuals as well as by the structure of this institution. So there are two institutions within the movement, within the Muslim Brotherhood movement. Those are Maktab al-Irshad and the Al-Shura Council, and that there was a change in the organizational structure in decision making. And he talked about the main transformation after al-Banna and the election of al-Khutaybi, who came from outside the movement since he had a legal background, but he didn't realize many of the points in relation to the efficiency of this movement. And he dealt with many of the issues from a purely legal perspective, losing the movement much of its efficiency, and then the movement was subject to much oppression, and afterwards it started to recover in the 70s and 80s when it started to spread among young people, particularly in universities. and students, and it received many of the votes during the elections. Our speaker also mentioned that there are two main directions within the Al-Irshad office or the leadership, including Abdul Manem Abul Futuh wa Isam Al-Arian, who talked for syndicates, unions, and students, and the other included Mustafa Mashhour, and the closed attitude, so to speak. This closed attitude was able to establish a strong organization under the strict security context. The Egyptian security cracked on the movement, but on individual basis rather than on the organizational basis, because it benefited from some of its charity and developmental work. The paper elaborated on some issues related to the geographical distribution of the leadership of the movement, that most of them came from the delta or from urban areas, leading to a pattern. So this is more or less a sociological analysis that the urban background was more predominant in the movement, and they tried to maintain the status quo, unlike other backgrounds who may have preferred a confrontational attitude. He said there were some common features for the movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, that there will be actors or people who are active in unions or in sections, and he talked about those who were in conflict with the old guard, and that the average age of the people in the leadership office, in the Irshad office, were 88 years. I want really to check on this. It's very old age. It means that half of them are even older than 88. And also there is a tendency to trust only those who are next of kin and directly related to the leaders or to the existing members of the Muslim Brotherhood. He talked also about the dissent that took place within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood after the revolution. Our first speaker elaborated on this, but our second speaker talked about some block dissent, such as Al-Wasat paper and other parties, and we will have a case study on those parties in the next session. Most of those people were some of the public figures who were leaders in syndicate or union work. The movement also worked on an emergency reactionary mode and was reluctant in starting a confrontation, although the revolution was confrontational. The decision makers within the Muslim Brotherhood maintained the priority to maintain the organization itself and for its own survival. The initiative to participate in the revolution came from the young people away from the leaders and created pressure on the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood, and this has become very well known. And also, he talked about the agreement with the military organization that that the movement would not run for presidency, but then instead, when the parliament was dissolved, instead of going back to the public opinion and to the a confrontational approach in order to impose the return and restoration of the parliament, they proposed running for a presidency. And I believe yesterday in Dr. Hishmat's paper, he also referred that this was not something that was decided unanimously, but almost by 50% of the members. So ultimately, he concluded saying there was this fissure and disagreement between the leadership, the shura, and the young people, and that you would find certain figures who dominate the three major functions in the Muslim Brotherhood, which gave them much power. Actually, we have given those two papers more time than we would usually, because our third speaker could not make it. We have two commentators. First of all, Mr. Yasser Fathi, could you please join me? Come and sit next to me, and then we will move to Ms. Dr. Tariq Al-Zumar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. First of all, I would like to thank Siga and Dr. Sami Al-Arian for his invitation and for this interesting symposium. I also thank Dr. Ammar Fayed and Mr. Shadi, both very distinguished scholars and researchers, and for their outstanding papers and conclusions. My comment is going to be a bit interactive with the papers, so I have benefited a lot from those papers. So my comment would be a sort of a discussion to try to trigger some thoughts about those papers. What I would like to start by asking, who are we talking to when we are discussing the Muslim Brotherhood? Are we addressing the Muslim Brotherhood? When we discuss anything like poverty, are we only talking for the poor? No, we always think that this is addressed to a certain category of people, but in actuality, public affairs mean that we are all either benefiting or being harmed by whatever occurs in the public affairs. So when we are talking about actors in public affairs, we're talking about ourselves and to ourselves. Even if I'm not myself an actor or a member of that movement, I am affected by it. And for the Muslim Brotherhood, it is a big organization and movement. So for anyone who wants to benefit from the context, the circumstances, the generations, the history that the Muslim Brotherhood went through, it's such a rich experience from which we can learn regarding, regardless of whether it was mostly success or mostly failure. We can benefit hugely from this experience because it's a huge experience from which anyone can learn and benefit. So in actuality, we're talking for ourselves and all of those who are concerned with Egyptian affairs. Very briefly, first of all, I would like to point out the issue of methodology in relation to the generations. I agree with what Ahmad Fayed mentioned, that there was no generational conflict having two different tendencies or orientations, but in research, we do not deal with generations only in that sense, but we redefine the idea of generation. For example, one of the concepts of generalizations, that a certain event creates a new awareness and collective consciousness within a group of people who redefine themselves and reimagine their historical role at that point in time. So that event would recreate people's imagination and perception of their own role. And I believe there was a conference in 2017 by the Arab Studies Center on Generations, and I believe I heard a paper by Mr. Ahmed Touhami, which was very interesting in that regard. And also the point mentioned by Shadi about the impact of the security crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood approaches. I would like to refer you to an article in 2009 by Issam Al-Arian, the late Issam Al-Arian. It was a long article, although the archive is not available anymore, but I believe the article can be still found online. And he talks about the side effects of the security crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. He is a leader in that. He was a leader in that movement at the time, and he talked about the impact of the security strikes on this urban-rural division. He referred to it quite frankly, and that the security have a political approach and they try to strengthen the Muslim Brotherhood somewhere and weaken it elsewhere. But and also another point I wanted to raise, Mr. Ammar mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood or the community of the Muslim Brotherhood outside Egypt started to meet one another or get to learn about one another suddenly, and that's very critical. Many members of the Muslim Brotherhood found out that they did not have proper communication with Muslim Brotherhood like themselves. They were only active in vertical communication with the leadership, and that they themselves individually were not active, but they were active in the sense of being within the community, within the committees, within the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Hannah Arendt talked about authoritarian and autocratic regimes, and she used a certain description that I'm going to use for comparison purposes. She said autocratic or totalitarian, or let me say centralized regimes, how they need a lot of they need the masses. But why do they need the masses? They make the individual within those masses isolated from other individuals within the same mass, and their value would derive from their presence in those masses. So the point here is that the Muslim Brotherhood came for change. Who was more, who influenced the other more? Was the Muslim Brotherhood more influential on the autocratic regimes, or were the regimes subconsciously more influential on the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood? So they sort of were infected by the same autocratic movement. So those individuals found themselves unable to do anything as individuals when they were individuals apart from the masses of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the same actually applies to people in autocratic regimes. The opposite should be the case. It is the individuals who give the power to the government. So the third point I wanted to point out was institutional confidence or trust, mentioned also by Mr. Ammar. This issue of trust, there was a huge trust in the institution of before the revolution, regardless of the details. But what was this trust all about? It was about the ideas. Members who joined the Muslim Brotherhood movement did not join because of a political program, but because of a historical interpretation and an idea and a description of the present and a proposal for the future, an ideology, basically. So there was this trust. But in the static situation of the political arena, those ideas are not put to test. But when those ideas are at stake and are tested in certain conditions, people see the results not in reports or statements, but on the ground. They would see whether this idea is really able to solve any problem at any time or place. We supposedly have the solution for any time or place. It's written out, it's ideal. That idea. So I mean, me as grassroots, as a member of the grassroots, why didn't this work at the time of Hassan al-Banna, the founder and inspirer of the Muslim Brotherhood? In this case, those promises and assumptions related to the perception and the project, they were crushed, basically, including the assassination of Hassan al-Banna and the crushing of the organization, be it the resistance movement, the those who were arrested, or those who worked on a community level. And there was the other stumbling and during the Nasserite region, and then during the Sadat region, regardless of the leadership, we had Dr. Ibrahim al-Munir or Ahmed Hussein or anyone else. There was a Sisi, Sadat, or Jamal Abdel Nasser, or Mohammed Najib, or even King Farouk. Different regimes, occupation, free officers, monarchy, Jamal Abdel Nasser, Sadat, Sisi, and even the revolution and self-governance by the Muslim Brotherhood for a year. So you went through many tests, basically, coup d'etat, victory in October, setback in 1967. Then you ruled after a popular revolution, etc. But there were many symbols. It was very clear. So the generation that had no background, did not read about the history, went through this experience without reading about any background. It was spontaneous during the revolution. And people have moved, they're calling for their own rights. Now it's time to move. There were some of the Muslim Brotherhood armed members who went and tried to change the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. Those young people just were not reading in order to implement something. They didn't know about the decisive points that the Muslim Brotherhood went through earlier or historically. So they acted spontaneously and they were surprised that this solution did not work. Shouldn't have Islam worked in this case? And of course it didn't, and the problem is not in Islam. So this contradiction between the ideas I had in mind and what happened on the ground required interpretation and explanation and a solution. So there were some ironies. For example, if we talk about the administrative aspect, the first in-laws of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time of Hassan al-Banna by the very founder in 1963, sorry, 36 or 30, actually, the very first. One of the ironies in administrative terms, there was an article, Article 4 says administrative structures is the last thing that Muslim Brotherhood thinks about. It is a secondary issue. It turned out that it wasn't secondary after all. It was the main issue for them. The second point was a political change. So people needed vision, regardless of whether they agreed or not. So Hassan al-Banna, they had to issue an in-law in order to be consistent with the laws at the time of the license as an association. Well, there was something done by Hassan Banna that he didn't have to do. So the change of the in-laws that needs to be that require 2/3 of the votes, but he added something that's sort of supra-constitutional article. So he said that nothing of this law can be changed unless so and so percentage of the members agree, but in any case, Article 2, 3, and 6 can never be changed. So about what was this article? I read it to anyone from the Muslim Brotherhood, there would be stunned. It said that this association does not work with any political aspects at all. This is so surprising. Of course, this was changed by Hassan al-Banna himself to where he talked about different details. So this is such an irony. So sometimes we imagine certain aspects of the interaction that make it confusing. Uh, Let me. Oh, there is another irony I want to refer to in those in-laws, etc. Sometimes Hassan al-Banna would have. He had a message called "Towards the Light." It was very well known within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was first drafted in 1935 or so. This message was sent to many governors, many rulers and kings, and it was good. You explained the importance of Islamic orientation, etc., and sometimes would point out the importance of some of the practical practices, political projects. So it involved many good things, but it involved references that we may not imagine at the time. So many members of the Muslim Brotherhood in which Hassan al-Banna, he talked about more scrutiny, because at the time there was no democratic attitude, even with this other movements, particularly Islamic movements. So one of the advice presented by Hassan al-Banna, number 6, that the public servants, their conduct cannot be separated from their professional performance. So his advice was to censor or observe people at work or outside. And this is what the states are doing, actually. So the state now holds us to account and spies on us inside our homes as well as in our offices. Of course, that's not what Hassan al-Banna wanted at the time, but that was a sort of a translation of what he said. He also talked about censorship of cinema, media, etc. So when those tools are proposed to the power, to the authority, what happens? Now we know very well what happens. There was a time where there was administrative interaction, regardless of the analyses of the problems. Since Hassan al-Banna, there was administrative mobility. So there were people who would take decisions, be it running for presidency or going to Palestine. I'm not saying that the decisions were wrong, but the results were not good. So this organization, this movement, what does it organize? You have ideas, a project, a conduct, you have the outcomes, and then you compare with other paths. So, but if you don't have the answers, if you don't have this organizational answer of why those ideas didn't work, why they stumbled. For example, you say that it's easy for al-Rashidi Caliphate to be restored. But the question is, when did the Rashidi Caliphate appear or disappear? It was very long ago. So why did it disappear, and why didn't it why wasn't it restored? I'm not saying it was impossible to restore, but I'm saying that it's important to ask those questions, that the first generation after the caliphate failed to restore it or did not restore it. So even if it's an Islamic caliphate, we don't want it to be inherited power. We don't want it to be autocratic. So no one historically was able to restore that, to restore it. It's very easy to say, but one of the issues, the ways we use in discourse analysis is to say that we have this conceptualization. We don't have uh, this conceptualization that did not materialize. You have a project that stumbled regardless of the generations of the leaders and the different generations of the Muslim Brotherhood. So why would you be different? So those ideas or this practice and this modification to your practice, you always say it's the circumstances, what's and the context. So there are many questions outstanding with as long when we stumble for that long, we can't now say that we have just an administrative issue. But now there are many problems. Even when you gather people who want to discuss the problem, then you it's many of much often you don't have qualified people to talk about political planning or strategic planning or governance, etc. So just by good faith to do something good is not enough, because we will disagree later. All the instances of people who dissented from the Muslim Brotherhood, you would always find the problem was administrative and then ideational.
So the changes were for what is fixed, what is flexible, what is correct, what is wrong. So if you are allowed for your discretion and you can be creative, suddenly they will tell you, no, what you are saying or your creativity is against the fixed ideas. So which is not allowed to be creative about. So how are we going to solve that? So if we discuss, for example, and we found that there are differences in the discretion, and we say that this discretion, self-discretion, is against the fixed things. So what happened in 2015, for example, that and we have read from those people, this is not the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, because each one of them has something different and has a different project. So the administrative entrance or entry point not necessarily lead to that, because it requires, or it is about the capability of those people who are going to be there, and about other aspects. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I took a long time in my comments. Thank you very much, Mr. Yasser, for your comment. You had a very rich and nice comment that enriched the discussion, and I hope that the lecturers will take it into consideration when they answer. We have Mr. Tariq, who is with us, or maybe he was with us. Dr. Tariq, are you still with us? I'm here, yes. The floor is yours, Dr. Tariq.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of God, first, I would like to greet my great friend, Dr. Samir. Dr. Tariq, we have echo. I don't know if someone from the people here, or if you have two devices open, so we are getting a feedback or an echo.
لحظة واحدة نعالج الموضوع فنيا.
Okay, wait for 1 second so we can solve this issue technically.
في موجود مرتين بس
تفضل.
Go ahead, please.
أولا نحيي صديقي العزيز
To thank
شامل عريان على دعم
Dr. Sam Alian for this invitation
فكرة
and the organizers of this symposium.
دكتور طارق، يظهر انك انت دخلت عن طريق الكمبيوتر ولا
Dr.
التليفون؟
Tariq, are you on the phone or on the computer?
التليفون مغلق؟
Is your phone closed?
لانه في اشكاليه
Because we have a problem. We can't hear you
أنا
well.
شايف جهازين عندك.
I see that two devices are
لا
open.
يظهر انه لم يغلق. فاذا ممكن
It seems that it is not closed. So make sure that it is closed so we don't get that feedback from your other device.
هو مقفول ولكن
لا مغلق التليفون.
طيب لحظه. طيب تيمور can you get that؟ اوكي خلاص تفضل الان.
Okay, go ahead please.
تفضل دكتور طارق.
You can proceed, Dr. Tariq.
نعم الان تفضل.
Now we hear you well. Go ahead. Okay. Bismillah. First, I would like to greet Dr. Samin Alian for this invitation, and I would like also to greet the organizers of this organization and the idea of evaluating the Islamists in governance. This is a highly important topic because the outcomes will be very important for the Islamic project at large and for all the people where Islamists reached governance where it was thought of as a trap, and it affected all of the people in the country and their unities in some cases. I would like also to greet Dr. Ammar, Dr. Shadi for their important intervention and the comment of Dr. Yasser. I'm not going to get into the details of the vision of the Muslim Brotherhood and the circumstances because they talked about that, but I'm going to tackle another aspect that is related of the Muslim Brotherhood experience in Egypt, because it is an experience that the Islamists participated in, and all Islamists were behind this experience and tried to support it. But this experience was largely affected by the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood and their organizational structure, as some of the colleagues mentioned, and it has also its relation with the it has a certain relationship with the regime.
Recording in
الجهات
progress.
المتنفذة للثورة حتى الآن في استكمال نجاحها. فمن المهم أن أؤكد أيضا في بداية مداخلتي أن تجارب تحرير الأمم والشعوب يجب ألا تستسلم لنظرية المؤامرة، لأنه لم يتحرر شعب من الطغيان.
And people should not surrender to the conspiracy theory, because no dictatorship or colonization would have fallen if we didn't if we surrender to conspiracy theories. If we go through that, should be uh, if they're going to talk about forces that will confront them and that will make them fail, then they should have not gone through this way or tried uh, to go through the revolution. So those four, we lost this. So we can look at, from this perspective, we can say that the revolution of the 25th of January didn't fail. First of all, because popular revolutions last for longer times, and they get stable only after a long time. That's why I say that the dream that the January Revolution has provided can never be eliminated, no matter how they try to do so. Also, popular revolutions are different in their methods and their maturity, based on the community and the goals of the revolution that are adopted. In Egypt, we see that they accept the revolution values slowly, but they are not different from other communities. In addition to that, the historic events cannot be judged in quick terms, but rather should be judged against larger periods of times in order to be more correct. And this is something that we need to take into consideration, that the popular revolution is a success by itself, even if it didn't achieve its goals, because it is a revolution against injustices and against the inappropriate living conditions that people live. So this revolution makes people aware of these grievances. It also helps people to reject and resist the attempt to make them just like animals, or like an axe fixed to a wheel in an agrarian land. So I believe that we were in a very important period, in the period where the Muslim Brotherhood were in power, but we were unable to seize that opportunity, and we failed to continue with the most important factors of success, include which included the failure of the one of the most prominent dictators in the Middle East, and it put his clique in a very awkward position after the revolution, and it united the people for the first time on or around unifying goals, including the fall of the regime and the social justice. And they started, for the first time, the people called for the toppling of the president and the leave of the regime. And it became a reality. The revolution became a reality that Egyptians lived for 2.5 years, in which we have seen high values that in Egypt that people still talk about. And it also succeeded in stopping the corruption that Egyptians suffered from a lot. And the combating corruption led the Egyptian regime to put the head of the Central Inspection Authority, in a prison. Before the revolution, the regimes would make walls or build walls between the different currents, and they don't allow them to communicate with each other. Someone said that when I discovered that the sons of the Islamists are with the sons of the liberals go together or spend some time together on coffee is a problem or a crisis that I never imagined that it will happen. So this shows how they create these walls between the different currents. The revolution also, for the first time, for 6 years, we had elections, fair elections, where the Egyptian people discovered itself, explored itself, and the world saw that the Egyptian people want to select their representatives through the ballot boxes. It also managed to put aside the military dictatorship and to accept a civilian president, salute him, and be obedient to him. It also managed to dismantle the hardcore of the dictator, the military regime that we had in Egypt, which failed to continue controlling the dictatorship machine. It also succeeded in making the judges feel afraid of the people, although the people before that, or because the people before that were completely neglected. All the decisions or the policies and all of the means that will not make that day or will make any impact of that day at any point in time for the people. Also, as I started, what made this opportunity fail? In my opinion, maybe the failure of understanding the military council, which was a major mistake that everybody shared in that mistake. In addition to leaving the squares was one of the reasons as well, and not making use of the mistakes that were made by the military council, which could have changed the civilians' moods. In addition to that, the legitimacy, also the legal legitimacy, was not used. Everybody looked at the period of Morsi, and they forget about the legal and political legitimacy of the people's representatives in the parliament. And the parliament was busy with marginalized things that focused on surrounding the forces of the revolution. The parliament at that time didn't act as a parliament that was elected by the largest percentage of the people, by the voters, and it was dissolved in a very in a shame way. This was clear for all the forces of the deep state, and for the first time in the military establishment, they show up a civilian president that they have to salute, but the forces of the revolution were unable to continue that path, and there were decisions made that were not legitimate by virtue of the people's decision. Since the invitation of the Minister of Defense in December 2012, it gave some significant groups against the president. In addition to that, or in other, there were, and the media and there was also dealing with the coup itself. There was a problematic, and sometimes and that was a problematic for a lot of people, and whether it is the media force also of the people outside. They didn't, it wasn't used enough to make legitimacy on the ground, and there was problems for this using the social media was very important, but it wasn't used well, and there was inability to confront the change that will transform the revolution into a ruling regime. All of these problems led to the failure of the experience.
Even with the 11th anniversary that we have right now, and we can revive this project within rules that are new, that require a new perspective and a review of the approach. Thank you so much, Dr. Tariq, on this elaborate examination of the challenges of the Islamic movement in politics and governance. And it's time now to receive any comments from the attendees or participants before we give the chance for the speakers to respond. We start with you, Dr. Amr. Please go ahead. Thank you so much. I thank the distinguished speakers. There were a few questions I had because I wasn't a member of those older movements or groups. If we look at the Muslim Brotherhood movement based on the perspective you offered, which is that it is a discrete and a declared organization, it's a political as well as a revolutionary organization, more or less like the leftist revolutionary movements. I'm trying to say that it included its own many contradictions within itself. So it was a discrete, secret movement, but not secret at the same time. Revolutionary and political. All. So is it a political movement or a social movement or a liberation movement? And this requires a resolution of those contradictions, because contradictions lead to a confusion in the perception of the public. So who are you, and through what perception can I deal with you? And this mixing of the three aspects within the organization may cause the external spectator or observer see things in with lack of clarity, and create mutual misunderstandings even between the upper ranks and the lower ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood itself. So this requires clear identification and address them. And is it better to separate those tracks from one another, social, political, and liberation, or is the nature of the movement, does it necessitate that those three parts are intertwined? And also, liberation movements it is very hard for them to be democratic themselves. So this is one of the aspects that make them become autocratic when they take power. But what's the solution? If we believe that the Muslim Brotherhood is a liberation movement, and that's the point of view I hold, if we believe it's a liberation movement, can it be as democratic as you are calling it to be? I believe within the context, the hostile environment and the challenges, it's very hard for it to maintain such level of democracy. I believe we need to strike a balance to be active, but at the same time be safe within those security threats. The other point is the restoration or the recovery of the movement after the blows it received in the 40s, in the 60s, and even in 2013. But this ability of the movement to restore and recover itself, as Mr. Ammar mentioned, that the movement was able to recover, and as soon as it was recognized, it was able to recover. So was this resilience or ability to recover something good or bad? Is it something that can be copied or learned from? So this resilience or strength of this movement and the benefit for the Egyptian community from its presence. After the January Revolution, can we say that there was failure at all levels, or were certain things part of the natural evolution of the Egyptian community? Change, particularly profound change and transformation in nations, require more than one cycle and more than one stage. So was it only more than that? Thank you, Dr. Amr. Praise be to God, the merciful, the compassionate. Peace and blessings be to Prophet Muhammad. Thank you. I thank all the speakers and the commentators. We have been informed of much profound perspectives and information in relation to evaluating the internal organizational crisis within the Muslim Brotherhood and the nature of the hierarchy and decision-making mechanisms. I have a comment first and then a question. First of all, in relation to the generational issue, and the brothers who presented the papers and who commented on the papers mentioned that there is no real crisis in a generational gap between the generations of the Muslim Brotherhood. But let me say that the most prominent evidence of this generational gap or crisis was the issue with the average age of the people, the members of the leadership office, al-Irshad office. If this information that the average was 88 years, even if that's not accurate, it's close to reality. I'm sorry, can you ask the speaker to speak to the microphone? I think they said they reviewed this information and the average is 68. The members are 18. So this means that succession between generations is problematic. So in our Sudanese Islamic movement, we have faced that generational succession problem. And our leader, Turabi, used to mock the leaders of traditional parties, saying that they would remain forever in power, but it applied to him personally. Leadership in the in the Islamic movement remained the same for a long time. It had to change even every 10 years. It would have made a greater transformation. And I believe this generational issue is a major issue in Islamic movements and has to be addressed very profoundly. To say that there are no unified ideas or common ideas in the younger generation of the Muslim Brotherhood does not mean that there was no generational problem in the first place. My question now is that was there any major infiltration by the regime or by opposing or rival political parties into the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood? Actually, I tried to look up certain documents, and things related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Since I joined the Islamic movement 50 years ago, I joined the ranks of the Islamic movement since I was a young man, and we read a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. But the very strange information I learned today was that Hassan al-Nudaybi was from outside the group, from outside the movement, and he became the general murshid, or the general guide leader of the movement. So that's really strange. So I would say that one of the very serious issues is the issue of infiltration. It is something we suffered from in the Islamic movement in Sudan, and my personal perspective was one of the reasons for the failure of the Salvation government was the infiltration. So that's why my question is, were there any major infiltrations in the Muslim Brotherhood? Is there any question or comment? Thank you so much for the speakers and commentators. In terms of some, Dr. Layla Mahdi, thank you so much. It drew my attention that there were some similarities between the differences in geography and historical periods. And but this is sort of reassuring, because it is very important to network between those Islamic movements and learn from the shared experiences. Sometimes people would shed a new light on our own experiences. So one of the similarities is related to the community position from the movement after the revolution, that after the revolution, or after the coup d'etat, actually there was a negative attitude towards the movement on the grassroots level or the community level. So despite all the differences in Sudan at the beginning of the revolution in 2019, there was a mobilization among the ranks of the community, even the Islamists, against the Salvation movement, and even by some of the dissidents of so this mobilization started to reach all layers of society. Even children, even young men would repeat those attitudes and would hold those attitudes. So my question would be, this social psychology or societal psychology was used to mobilize against Islamic movement, but how far was this organized? It cannot be said to be a coincidence. How would people suddenly transform their attitude after a certain point in time? It's clear that this was a deliberate mobilization, but also in Egypt, it was 1 year of political experience in governance, but it until 60 years of acquaintance with the Muslim Brotherhood on the community level. And also one of the similarities was this internal dispute as well, particularly in the last 5 years of the Salvation government. Many of the leaders were excluded from within the Islamic movement. They wanted young people rather than the older generation to take the lead. And actually about 10 of the figures of the leadership were excluded, and it was such a blow for the Salvation, because the young generation that was given the leadership were not ready for that position yet. So this was an internal movement, but was there any external infiltration or effect that caused that, I wonder? And also this accumulative culture that some members were competent or incompetent. So after this division between the popular and the national, so people, certain members start to be like were left out and found that and they were not inclined to either side. So it just seems that people started to exclude one another, even on a small detailed disagreements. So anyone who would disagree with you, you would consider them outside your own organization or your own movement. So many people were excluded because of those minor disagreements or because of their confrontation with the leadership in the Islamic movement, and it started to become a part of the culture within the Islamic movement or the Muslim Brotherhood. So people started to call one another, you are a populist, rather than an actual member of this movement. But I believe that the most important point of similarity was the static situation, the when the movement was unsure what to do after the revolution. This is what we have right now, 3 years on. There is a lot of there is a static situation. It seems that there is this Al-Zubayr, the head of the Shura Council in the Islamic movement. The response was to hold composure and to calm down, but the process is ongoing. It seems that this process is integrating, and we are in a static position. So the young men and young members would always wonder, why are we standing still, and what are we waiting for? Are we waiting for the same fate as the Egyptian movement? So many young men are wondering, why are we standing still? Are we actually infiltrated? Because it's not like us to stand still in those circumstances. And have we paid the price for the past 3 years? And we will continue to pay the price for how long? So actually, this is not a good omen as long as the young generation is held still by a call for a more rational approach, so to speak, by the older generation. I believe this may only get worse. So despite the difference in the age of the experience of the Islamic movement in Sudan, in governance, and 30 years versus 1 year only for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, nonetheless, I see many similarities, and this makes me insist that those reviews need to be made on a cross-cutting level across all Islamic movements. And let me also go back to the issue of the idols of the modernization, that the law itself is considered by some as the idols, and the constitution itself, but sometimes they would eat it up when it doesn't play in their favor. And this takes me back to Ted Kaczynski's saying that when the law is in the hands of unjust people, then only outlaws will make justice. So it is important to remember that modern Arab state has become a weapon against its own people, against the Muslims. It's trying to enslave or make people worship something else. Thank you so much, Dr. Leila, and I thank everyone for their comments. Actually, we are past our time, but it's time to give our speakers to respond in no more than 5 minutes. Thank you so much for the comments and for the questions. Actually, all the comments complement the ideas of the paper. I have no reserve on anything that has been mentioned. For example, you mentioned the issue of mobilization, and I am completely convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood cannot recover unless they would enhance individual initiatives. It is such a huge movement, and it faces huge challenges, and it's going to be very hard for the movement to undertake all the missions. So the movement should refrain from its idea of centrality and promote individual initiatives to establish sub-institutions, etc. In order for the movement to recover its own. Is the administrative aspect one of the outlets? I understand the idea you're trying to make, but in order to answer those questions or to undertake an evaluation, you need a proper administration. So that's why we are saying that the administrative issue is paramount. Is the organization or is the movement able to recover after all of those blows? I am still convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood is deep-rooted within the Egyptian society. It has many issues related to transparency, the devolution of power or circulation of power, accountability, but the organization remains strong. There is still a leadership that's capable of communicating and orienting and instructing its own members. It faces many challenges that are emerging, that they did not experience before, but they remain more organized and stronger than any other organization in the Arab world. And the continuance of the Egyptian state in tracking down their funds and their figures and their leaders and arresting them is a recognition of their role and of their existence and salience. We're talking about a group or a movement that includes hundreds of thousands of members. We're talking about movement that is very diverse and widespread in the Delta, in Alexandria, in Cairo, in Said. It includes farmers as well as academics, as well as various diverse members. And this, I believe, is an advantage despite all the disadvantages in terms of the centralized approach, etc. We are in a very fragile situation in Egypt. The performance of the state is, and the civil society has been marginalized by the state. It has rendered it a sub branch of the government itself under its control, or it has weakened it to a level that makes it unable to actually effect any change. So even when we're talking about smaller humanitarian initiatives such as a Risala or etc. So when we have a popular civil organization with a political character such as the Muslim Brotherhood movement, I believe this in itself is an advantage, but the question is how to make use of that advantage, how to make use of that ability rather than leave it idly. The question is, the final question is the Muslim Brotherhood prone to infiltration? Of course, any political organization and movement can be infiltrated. Actually, even military organizations may be infiltrated. So it would be no surprise for us to find out that there is a deep infiltration in the Muslim Brotherhood ranks. That's in principle, but is the current situation is a result of infiltration? That's not necessarily. There are many factors that played into the situation we are now. So even if we have infiltration is not the main player and is not the main reason. It may play into the current situation, but we have problems related to the structure and organization, etc. The final point before I give the floor to Shadi, the contradictions within the Muslim Brotherhood, or the definition of Muslim Brotherhood, as Dr. Amr referred to, and also Dr. Kamal also referred to yesterday. The result is a strength, but also stumbling. So when you are a wide-ranging, a widespread organization, you would find members who have only a religious motive to affiliate with this movement, or they are social activists. So they work with civil society, they work with the community, or they have a political ambition. So there is a wide range of activities for the movement, which reflects wide-ranging motives for the members to affiliate with this movement. So this means that when this movement stumbles politically at certain points, it remains functional in other levels, because for the members, it has become a sort of a community, not only a political actor. People affiliated with it have familial relations, personal relations, and even their surroundings are related to the Muslim Brotherhood. So this diversity makes the relation, but it results in stumbling in practice. So when we had a political disagreement, it reflected on all the activities of the movement, not only the political track, but also the dawah and the charity tracks. And there was a sort of a confusion as well. When an organization or a movement is so diverse, what would the leadership reflect? Should they be politicians? Should they be social activists? Should they be scholars or dawah scholars? Very often you would find that the leadership and shura members would be from a dawah background, but incompetent in terms of understanding the political context, even when they select political leaders. So you would take someone who is active socially or in charity, and you would put them in the parliament because they used to solve problems on a community level. In this case, you actually infringed on their social and dawah role and put them in a political role that they are incompetent for. So the ongoing discussion should involve discussion, the definition of the Muslim Brotherhood, and is it a political body? Does it require or need a political party status? Or is it only a pressure group? This wide-ranging activity, although it's beneficial, but it also has its downside, which was very clear after the revolution, and answering those questions is important for the movement itself, within the ranks of the movement. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Of course, the comments by Dr. Yasser included very valuable additions. And of course, the paper, Amar's problem, was also outstanding. Let me talk about the comments. Dr. Amr mentioned something about the ideas. And he said that there is a problem within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood in dealing with any political event, because of an idea, their attitude towards dealing with existing events. So it's a reformist group that dealt with a revolutionary act, and we had this debate: are we revolutionaries or reformists? And it caused a lot of disturbance in their attitude or their dealing with the revolution. But if we see other examples, for example, in Iran, Al-Khamenei would mobilize for the idea for 10 or 15 years. He mobilized among the scholars as well as among the community ranks, and he created the critical mass that would uphold his model by creating a complete new mode of governance. And I'm not evaluating the value of that system, but I'm evaluating the approach here. I'm saying that he used a different approach. So in general, when you adopt a certain set of ideas, you are forced to deal with a certain set of tools that through which you are able to interact with developments and changes, international pressures, etc. Not only the community stakeholders, because you are also in conflict with external actors. You're talking about regional stability, etc. And most organizations or from civil society organizations or associations are unaware of the regional dimensions and how their very presence constitutes a threat to a certain equilibrium. Now we have assertions such as Taliban, Hamas, Houthi, Hezbollah, Houthis, and Hezbollah. I'm not saying that it is only those militarized movements are the only ones who can deal with the regional powers, but what I'm saying is that we have this surging movements, these surging movements that have started to play an important role, while the Islamic movements who focused only on democratic transformation as a method for change and the transformation to establish a regime different from the existing regime, they fell into the trap of so-called democracy, in which you kill the revolution in a way by going and being involved in a game in which your rival is more experienced and have better tools to win the game. So hence we have a problem not only at the level of ideas, but at the level of the presence of a cohesive mass of people that can implement those ideas. In Sudan, more or less, that was available when they were planning for the coup. They were training in Libya, and then they failed, and they realized they needed to work on their qualifications better, and that they needed to work on institutional level and to infiltrate and have 30% or 20% of their people in various institutions. So when they reached a specific mass, they started the salvation movement. So they established a different regime or a different system of governance with a different structure. Of course, I'm not saying it was perfect, but it has a different tribal and communal structure, but it took its project with a different approach. And when Hassan al-Turabi started to focus on the strengthening of civil society organizations with the Islamic movement, which at the time did not have a political role and needed a political outlet in a way, although it had a strong presence in the army, which made it an important actor. What I'm trying to say is that the community itself develops and evolves in ways that many of us are not aware of. Let's say between 2004 until 2009, we started to have bloggers. And then between 2009 and 2015, we had Twitter and Facebook.
Now, with TikTok and Instagram, we have a kind of active participation of the community. We have a kind of interaction between the community or the youth in the community. Most of the political groups are unaware of that, and most of the organizations, I'm talking even about the state itself, one of the reasons of the fall in 2011 because it didn't understand the impact of social media on the mobilization of the youth. Now, the state is now controlling people more and monitoring people more, but in order to control uh, the people, but it has nothing to do with having a mass that is effective and that can work and do actions. In the past, we were talking about 8% of people who have internet. Now we're talking about more than 60% of the people who have internet. And when they are interacting on social media, this is a mass that can make a change. So the threat is still there in Egypt, and the regime is always keen not to have any mass that is capable of doing something. As Dr. Ammar mentioned a while ago, the group is still there. It is weak in its actions, but the security, why the security is doing or trying uh, to do any to act with them, because what happened in the camel battle when the people went to the square or the freedom square, there was a problem, and maybe we can see that that was the beginnings of or the end of the February revolution. So in general, the transition should have its own philosophy. And when we talk about the polarization and the agreements, this is one of the entry points that movements can use, because at the end, the ideology is one aspect, but the creation of consensus are tools that can be made for a temporary solutions, but not a fixed or for a long time solution. So what we see now, the regime is and now is there. This is something that we cannot deal with. What we need to focus more on, those who can make good theoretical framework, they will be better in affecting the scene through the work that they can do, whether inside Egypt or in the region at large. Thank you very much. At the end of this session, I would like to thank the lecturers, Dr. Ammar Fayed and Mr. Shadi Ibrahim, as well as the commentators, Dr. Tariq Al-Zumar and Mr. Yasser Fathi, as well as other commentators. And now we will have a break. It will be followed around 3 o'clock. That's the third symposium under the title The Lessons Learned and Prospects for the Future. We have different papers with equal importance, so hope to see you here in the room as well as online. Thank you very much. And